Okay, a very good evening to all of you gathered here. We, the team of Mural Lectures, the flagship lecture series of IIT Madras, welcome you all to the fireside chat on the theme Religious Pluralism in India History with our esteemed guest, Mr. Manu S Pillai. For the best possible experience, I request the audience to keep their mobiles on silent mode and avoid any form of disturbances. Today, we have with us one of the youngest yet most multifaceted individuals of our lineup, Mr. Manu S Pillai. He was educated at Fergusson College, Pune and at King's College, London with degrees in economics and international relations, and then went on to manage the parliamentary office of Dr. Shashi Tharoor in New Delhi, and then was the aide to Lord Karan Bill Moria. The same year, he was commissioned by the BBC as a researcher to work with Professor Sunil Khilnani on the Incarnations History series, which tells the story of India through 50 great lives. The Ivory Throne is Manu S Pillai's first book. He became a full-time historian and writer, and this debut book brought him the Sahitya Akademi Yuva Puruskar in 2017. Rebel Sultans, Pillai's second work, narrates the story of the Deccan from the close of 13th century to the dawn of 18th century. His writings have appeared in the Hindu, Open Magazine, the Times of India, Hindustan Times, the New Statesman, and other publications. We are grateful to have him here.
Thank you.
I now invite our faculty advisor, Dr. Basavaraj, to present Mr. Manu S Pillai with the Angvastram. I now hand it over to the moderators of the session today, our speaker curators, Kirtana and Asha.
Yes, a very good evening, Manu. We're all very incredibly proud to have you here today, and I hope the entire audience, they're just waiting for this chat to start, and without much ado, let's get started. Yes, so let's start the discussion with the definition of pluralism. What, according to you, is religious pluralism, and how do you view it in the modern context? And also, in the light of this, can you comment on the nature of Indian secularism and its relation to religious pluralism?
So pluralism in general is what we see around our country, right? If you look at this classroom itself and we look at the languages the students here speak, you're from Tamil Nadu, the two of us are from Kerala. We're from different parts of Kerala. She probably speaks a dialect of Malayalam. I probably speak a very different dialect of Malayalam. In North Kerala recently, I went and a friend of mine claims that I've invented a word that doesn't exist. But I've grown up listening to that word because it exists in my part, but it doesn't exist in their part. It's the same with religion. The religion isn't, we are taught to think of one broad label. Religion as a concept itself is relatively new, assuming that X number of people follow one religion of one shape and one form. Often there are regional variations. So one example to give is Islam in Kerala is very different from Islam in Kashmir. Both are very different from Islam in Bhopal or in central India. It's the same with Hinduism. You have tribal gods who've come from the forests, who've come from beneath, as it were, and you've got Vedic gods who've come from above. You know, they've been brought in by migrants, brought in by people from the outside. It's the existence of all of these, not always in a peaceful way, not always comfortably, not always getting along, but there is a tendency to try and make space for all of these to coexist because you live in a diverse society with very many people, very many identities, very many hues, very many shades, which means you have to find a way to get along. And that's essentially our history with pluralism. For most Indians, it's not even something for the longest time we thought about. When I was growing up, I grew up in Pune in Maharashtra. So at home we'd speak Malayalam. On the street when we were playing, we'd pick up some Marathi. Or Hindi is what we often speak, which is very Dakhni Hindi, tu ara, main ja raha, that kind of thing. And of course there was English, which we studied in school. You had classmates who had different surnames, who came from different places. Each of them had different mother tongues that they spoke at home. So nothing was, just having multiple people of multiple shades, literally, of different skin colors, different dietary habits, different backgrounds. It was very normal. It was frankly when I went as a student to the West, when I was 20 years old, that I saw a lot more of a homogenized country. The French are French, the Germans are German. Indians are nothing like that. You know, we can mix and blend in a very different way. We pick up languages automatically if we grow up in urban spaces. My friends would sometimes be a bit puzzled because my mother would call and then I'd speak to her on the phone, and switching between English, Malayalam, sometimes in the same sentence, both would sort of, fluidly flow into each other. That, I think, is our experience of pluralism. One doesn't necessarily need great theories to explain it. If we just look at our lived reality and how we've all grown up, how our parents have grown up, how we've moved around, and the ease with which it's possible for us to negotiate it, that supplies its own answer. And you had a second part of the question on secularism, I think. I think the constitutional definition of secularism was created keeping this pluralism in mind, which is not to impose anything, at the same time not, claiming that none of this matters. It's therefore a kind of arrangement that's fitted or tailored specifically to our conditions.
So to put the topic into question, can you give some instances of religious plurality in our Indian history? Also, keeping in mind how have these lores and legends of our country played into plurality as a concept itself?
So there's a temple in Malabar. I think it's called Cherukunna. That's the place, and there's a Bhagavati there, a Devi. And the story goes that Cherukunna Bhagavati came all the way from Kashi. So obviously she came by a land route to somewhere where the sea was there, and then she came by boat. Now the man who brings her in the boat was a Muslim, a Muslim captain. He's the one who brings her finally to Cherukunna in Kerala, and then she's consecrated there in the temple. And when this Muslim captain dies, he's taken and buried nearby in what is the Oliyankara Masjid. And this exists over there. There's a Veerabhadra temple in a place called Cheruvattur, also in North Kerala, where if you go into the temple, you'll see these bronzes of a man without arms. And he's supposed to signify the Muslim friend of the deity. According to some retellings, he fought on behalf of the deity and protected the temple. Some have taken that story and applied it to Tipu Sultan's time, saying that this is a nameless Muslim warrior. Some have even given it a name. We don't know what is actually true and what is myth here, but how he fought for the temple and defended it when Tipu's armies were invading Malabar. So what you have is a Muslim king invading with what people would call an Islamic army in Malabar, but a local Malayali Muslim standing up and fighting with everybody else in that village against the invader. He didn't switch over and go on saying that, I'm also Muslim, the invader's also Muslim, that's my identity. But the very existence of those bronzes in the temple suggests that he was deified and turned into an important figure in the temple itself. You have stories in Kerala where, I'm speaking about Kerala because I know that best. In my own family, in a lot of temples in my part of Kerala, Syrian Christians were extremely important. So any of the ghee or oil that was brought into Orthodox kitchens or into temples, it required the touch of a Syrian Christian to purify it first. So you buy it from the market or whatever, but it would be kept outside the house. And then even if it was a 3-year-old Syrian Christian boy that you'd bring from a playground nearby, he had to touch it before it was brought into the house, because only the touch of a Syrian Christian purified these things. Ambalapura Krishna, again, very famous temple in the region. There's a famous payasam there called the Ambalapura Pal Payasam. When Ambalapura Krishna was brought there, there's a place called Kurichi, where he also rested in the house of a Christian. That's how that particular thing works. I was in Shabarimala recently because I've written about Shabarimala, I've read about Shabarimala, and I decided, I want to also see Shabarimala. So I went there, and as most people would know, the first stop you make at Erumeli is at Vavar's mosque, because that was Ayyappan's friend, and it's from the mosque that the most devout people start trekking up and making their way to Shabarimala. So these stories exist for a reason. I wouldn't say that we were a religious paradise where everybody got along happily all the time. The very fact that some of these stories exist to bring the two together suggests there was also tension. Implicit is the need to bring these things together, which means that people were also aware that they could force society apart. You have cases of religious tension also. For every, in quotes, good Mughal emperor, there will be an Aurangzeb people point out to. In Kerala also, we have instances in the 14th century. There was this instance again in North Kerala where Brahmins went and burnt down a mosque because the mosque had tiled its roof as opposed to having a thatched roof. And the understanding was that only the local temple could have a tiled roof, not the mosque. So clearly there were cases of religious antagonism also. In the 17th century, in the Deccan, you have an instance where Ganapati is taken to a Sufi shrine as part of the festivities around the shrine. But there are some conservatives there who feel, no, this accursed infidel god should not be allowed to participate in what is a Muslim ritual. So you have the opposite impulse also. But typically what you find in India is that because we're so diverse, because we're so complicated, the instinct has been to try and get along, and people tend to do that quite naturally. Just now, in Karekudi, I couldn't go, but a friend of mine went to a dargah, apparently built by one of the Nawabs of Arcot. And he said the place was full of Hindu women, and he was trying to find out why these Hindu women were sitting and singing bhajans in a dargah to a Sufi. And apparently, the story goes the Sufi had saved some Hindu women from sexual violation. Since then, people come there and pray for good husbands, for a happy marriage, that kind of thing. You find there's in Ahmednagar, I think, there is Shah Sharif's tomb dargah. It was built by a man called Maloji Bhosle, who was Chhatrapati Shivaji's grandfather. Maloji Bhosle didn't have children, and he went and prayed, or rather met Shah Sharif and got his blessings, and then he had 2 sons. And Shivaji himself writes in his Sanskrit court poem, the Shiva Bharata, his father and uncle, Shahji and Sharifji, were named after Shah Sharif, a Muslim saint. So there is the tendency to get along, even though there is tension. And I think these instances from the past are just another way to remind us as to what stories we want to tell about our present and our future. See, history is something that happened in the past. As I said, good things exist, bad things exist. But what stories we choose to focus on to construct the future is entirely on us. Some would prefer the stories of war and violence and violation because that creates certain, as I don't know if you're aware of you probably as humanities students are of the concept of imagined communities. All communities are imagined. And therefore, sometimes you use victimization to imagine a certain community. Sometimes you can tell more positive stories to imagine a broader, a very different kind of constructive, open-ended community. Those are choices that we have to make, or rather you guys have to make because you're younger than me.
In ancient Indian society, can we find instances of shared worship spaces, places where the ownership is held by different religions together? And keeping this in mind, how has this fostered ties between communities back then?
It's tough to say. I'm not an expert on the ancient period, but you do see that often the same areas, cave temples and so on, get assigned to religious groups, and they often coexist in similar parts of town and so on. You do find that, if the Jains or the Buddhists own certain caves, after a certain point, you'll find the Buddha has been replaced with the Vishnu. That's happened at Ellora, the famous caves. There's also violence. If you look at Kannada literature, Veerashaiva literature, very violent rhetoric and polemics against Jains. In Tamil Nadu, as late as the 20th century, in a lot of temple processions, they would carry images that represented an impaled Jain because it commemorated some historical violence or a memory of some violent moment. In the literature around a lot of the saints, the Tamil saints about 1,000 years ago, you find instances of a golden Buddha being melted down by the saint's power and then being used to construct a Vishnu temple. So shared spaces were there, but I think there was also plenty of antagonism for us to be a little cautious about reaching any generalized conclusions about what was happening. A lot was specific to specific areas. Even now, firstly, we have to get out of the pattern of thinking of Hinduism, Jainism, Buddhism. Within these, there were plenty of groups that didn't get along either. If the Shaivas fought against the Jains, they also irritated the Vaishnavas. There was plenty of debate and dissent between them also. I forget which temple it was in Tamil Nadu, but somewhere in the 16th century, there were also these Brahmins who went and threw themselves off a temple tower because they were protesting the installation of a Vishnu in that complex. And they said, no, this is Shiva's complex, and therefore we're going to commit suicide to prevent Vishnu from being consecrated here. So they also didn't get along. There's plenty of tension that way. But you also find that as time passes, there is a tendency to try and get people to, again, somehow get along. So Veerashaivas begin as a very anti-Brahmanical, rebellious force. If their own texts are to be believed, it was violently put down. But then by the Vijayanagara period, there's an understanding. They practically turn into a caste group of sorts with their own internal hierarchies. They absorb and come to terms with certain Brahmanical concepts and lose a lot of that original edge that they had. So in such context, you will find that today perhaps they wouldn't be completely against going to Shaiva temples, even though theoretically Veerashaivas don't believe in temple worship. So in that sense, shared spaces, shared concepts, etc. are possible. A lot is also borrowed, a lot is also stolen. You have, again in Kerala, we have in Paruvasheri, I think there was a Jain image which again transformed magically into Vishnu, and now it's considered Vishnu. Where I come from in Kerala, in Kandiur, it's a Shiva temple, a stunning Shiva temple. 823 AD. But in the 20th century, very close to the temple, someone was digging somewhere and they discovered a buried Buddha. And the theory is that the Buddha was thrown out of the temple and this place was converted into a Shiva temple. So it's a complicated, mixed up story. Not something we should be ashamed of, not something we should try and cover up, not something we should think is bad in some way. The past is complicated. The past is not about happy stories. We tell each other fairy tales when we want happy stories. If we want a more sober, mature understanding of reality, then we go into history. And we find interesting stories, but interesting also in a good way and a bad way. So it's a mixed up situation.
So in Indian history, there is this very constant romanticization of a lot of tales. Let's take, for example, Jodha Akbar, or let's take the story of Travancore Ranis, the Attingal Ranis, or Rani Lakshmi Bai, or a freedom struggle. So a question is, when we romanticize these various tales, right, are we obscuring the social realities of that time, like caste or gender? How does that play up?
See, one of the reasons some of these stories are romanticized and even dramatized is because a lot of history was coded and remembered through stories and narratives and very compelling tales. So you'd have a historical figure who existed, and like all human beings, they had a complicated life with good things happening, bad things happening. They would do valiant and great things, but they would also do horrible things and so on, because human beings are mixed up as well. But then in a time where there's no tendency to write records, in a tropical climate where records can't be preserved, a lot is then communicated over the forthcoming generations orally, through song, through lore. So when kids are taught things about great kings from the past or great events from the past, it happens in song and lore. In Kerala, there's the famous Nangeli story, which is this woman who cuts off her breast to protest an oppressive caste-based tax. And this popular story that goes around the internet is linked to the Irava community. But there's an exact parallel in a tribal community in I think, Pandalam, where the same thing happens, which makes you ponder, is this a template that it happened somewhere, and then different communities, to mark their resistance, to mark their protest against caste, appropriate the same template and tell their own stories. In that sense, is it fully historical? Did more than one woman have to cut off her breasts? Probably not. But it's still communicating a historical message of resistance and dissent to a caste-based order. You see, so even the dramatization, even romanticization happens for a reason. Dalit communities, marginalized communities, which had very little access to written text, to written material, the likelihood of them preserving their culture, them preserving their memories in song and lore is higher, which would involve some glossing, which would involve some, adding of color and juice, even if that's not necessarily what present-day historians would call factual, detailed, footnoted accounts of the past. So there's stuff like that. There's also oral history is interesting because even if you speak to our own elders, one story that I quite like is how in my grandmother's time, when she was a kid, they still, although slavery had been abolished in Kerala in the mid-19th century, when she was growing up, there were still Dalit families that actually tilled the fields. And they weren't allowed to come near the house. Every time they got married, they'd have to come and give something called Tambiran Panam, or the Lord's share, or some kind of an offering to the head of the family. They would, every time they had babies, they would come and it was the family head who would name the babies. And often it was demeaning names, Velambi, Karamban, Kartagutti, which is, fair one, tall one, dark one, names like that. And at this time, they would not take the names of any members of our family. They would always say Tambiran or Tambirati, which is my lord or my lady. But what's interesting is that the story goes that one day my great-grandmother discovered someone shouting her name in the distance, Edi Kalyani, in this very aggressive way, someone's calling out her name. And she goes out to check, who dares take my name like that in public? And it turns out all these men who are working in the fields, they've gone and named all the cattle after members of our family. So you're literally kicking a Kalyani, hitting a Madhavan, and getting Madhavan to plow and things like that. Now, it's kind of funny, but it's also interesting as to perhaps there is something happening there, right? You can't take these words, you can't take these names in one context, but in your own space, you have a way to do that. So I think when we say that there are romanticized narratives, they are all trying to communicate something. Oral narratives are all trying to tell you something. It may be one perspective, not the truth, but it is a perspective that historians are duty-bound to bring on board when trying to understand the past. So I wouldn't diss it in any way. The story of Tulukanachar in Tamil Nadu, Srirangam, Melkote in Karnataka, where there's an Islamic army from Delhi shows up. They've decided to invade South India. They go into all these temples and they, the usual, this is all in the temple chronicles. Things are being smashed, idols are being taken. And the story goes that the Srirangam idol, the Utsava Murti, was carried off to Delhi. And a lady very conveniently named Pin Tudarnavalli, she who follows all the way to Delhi, finds out what's happened to the idol, comes back all the way to Srirangam. Remember, this is some 13th century, yeah? And she comes back and she tells everybody in Srirangam, I know where your idol is, come with me. So then a bunch of Brahmins end up in Delhi and they dance and sing for the Sultan. Sultan's very happy. And like happy monarchs, he's happy to give them a boon. And he says, tell me what you want. And they say, we want our idol back. At which point he says, fine, the idol is sitting in some storeroom where all my plundered idols are kept. Notice here again, I don't think any sultans kept storerooms full of plundered idols. This is again just a gloss in the story. And at this point, they go and look, but the idol is missing. Because the sultan's daughter has decided it's a doll and she's taken it and she's playing with the idol. Temple chronicles, of course, can also be naughty because the chronicles also add that while she played with the idol like a doll during the day, in the evening it took human form and played games with her. You can read that as you like. Kind of mischievous, I think. But anyway, the deity puts her to sleep and agrees to go back to Srirangam. She wakes up and she's distraught and she pursues. She decides that she also wants to be with the deity. They hide the deity so that she doesn't get her hands on him once again. So when she arrives at Srirangam, she collapses and dies. Now, if you go to Srirangam today, not very far away from the Sri Kovil or the main sanctum, you'll see a little grill door. And if you peer through that grill door, you will see Tuluka Nachiyar's painting. This lady, has been commemorated inside the temple as a Tanjore wall painting. And she has been accepted by the deity as a wife. So when he does his evening rounds of the temple, all in big Hindu temples, the deity always comes out and has a round of the temple every day. And when that happens, he actually comes to her shrine also, where chapati and North Indian food, reflecting that Islamic past of hers, is offered. He, I think, is draped with a colorful lungi, because in South India, originally, the lungi used to be associated with Muslims. So again, here it's not even North Indian, it's actually South Indian, but it's used to signify that Islamic past. Now the question is, was there a princess like this? Is it even possible that the deity played games with her at night? Is it even possible that some Pintudarnavalli went all the way to Delhi and came back? Probably not. Yet, that story is trying to communicate something. The problem though is that these stories can also be used in other ways. In 1966 or so, there was a situation where Gorakshaks went and gheraoed Parliament, completely tried to besiege it. They went into Kamaraj's, the then minister Kamaraj's house, and plundered it and set it on fire and so on. And finally, Indira Gandhi's government had to call in the cops, and there was some firing, and I think the official record says 6 or 7 people died. Today, there are online right-wing websites that will say that 50,000 people were martyred in that incident, and they were all buried in mass graves that nobody knows where these graves are, etc. But that, one wonders whether in 100 years from now, a story like that, fed and remembered a certain way, repeated a certain way, will also become fodder and a way for a certain set of people to remember that past. The origin may just be 6 people killed, unfortunately, because they were trying to burn houses and get into parliament. But it might become a much more potent instrument a couple of generations later, with vastly inflated numbers, but which has power and which has significance, and it can move people who think this is reality and this is something that they can sort of gather around and form their own imagined community, as it were. So again, good as well as bad. Possibilities exist of a nature that we would call constructive, but they also exist of a nature that we could style as destructive. So these things, again, one has to look at with a certain maturity and a certain, sobriety of approach.
Yeah, so while we are at it, one question that often troubles us when we talk about this plurality and religious complexity, there is always this prevalence of Hinduism versus Islam, Hindu-Muslim binary. So how and when did these dualities and voices emerge, and do these debates sort of overshadow other religions?
I mean, they overshadow a lot of our own culture. When we think of one Islam or one Hinduism, we're again falling into a very Western trap, really, where religion was imagined as a core book and everything stems from the book. In reality, look at how Islam spread, not just in India, but also parts of Southeast Asia and all of that. Wherever Islam went, it would, initially through traders and through commercial embassies, it would adapt to local culture. So when Islam came to Kerala, supposedly in the lifetime of the Prophet Muhammad himself, because we have a mosque in Kodungallur that claims to be from that period, Even if it wasn't, by the 9th century, Muslims were signing royal grants and so on. And we have Arab names, etc., on inscriptions in Kerala. So clearly they were an influential group. They blended into local culture. So the Arakkal BV family, who were the only Muslim royals in Kerala, they follow the matrilineal system of succession. Like the local Nayars and like the local Rajas, they also follow succession through the female line, which has no official endorsement or support in Islamic law. Because local culture played a greater role there than theoretical law that was written in a different part of the world. Your core ideas may be the same. You may just turn your head to Mecca when you pray, but and all the royal families in Kerala claimed their patrimony as having been given to them by Chairman Perumal in a great partition that he did before he went to Mecca. So even in the founding political legend recorded by Brahmins themselves, Islam is already present. We have another Chera king who was supposed to have gone Buddhist. And then the Brahmins, dared him to a great debate and he lost. So he was expelled from the country. So you see that in play. One of the Perumals, there's an idol that was found where he's actually wearing a cross. This is also called Bana Perumal, Pallivana Perumal. And he's wearing a cross around his neck. So when local religions came into new parts of the world, the tendency pre-globalization, pre-technology, pre-easy access to your home country and so on, was to blend in with the local culture. It's the same with Hinduism. In Kerala, we know that the whole Parashuram legend, that Parashurama, after killing all the Kshatriyas, was looking for land to finally retire in and get some rest. And then he throws his battle axe from Gokarnam and it lands in Kanyakumari, and Kerala springs up from the sea. And then the Keralapati says he brings Brahmins into Kerala, indicating that this is a migrant culture that's coming in. The Keralapati goes on to say that when the first Brahmins come in, they can't stay here because it's infested with violent Nagas, a reference clearly to local tribes who don't want these people there. So a second wave of immigration happens, and then certain compromises are reached, and that's how Brahminical culture enters this place. Now, if you look at Kerala's Hinduism, both will be found. You'll find tribal gods. In my own ancestral family grove, our personal temple, we have a Vanadurga. Vanadurga is a goddess of the grove who wants the air, she wants the water to the rain to fall on her. She doesn't have a roof over her sanctum. Sometimes they construct walls, but it's usually left open. But we also have a Bhadrakali, who's the opposite. The Bhadrakali needs a roof over her head and she's worshipped in a different style. Because the Bhadrakali comes later, the Vanadurga is an original goddess who was already there. We have a deity called Airaveli Munnodi, which none of us in the family know what this deity is about. Turns out it's linked to the Koravar tribe. And it also turns out, I then discovered that Kauravas used to live in that place till our family displaced them. So we displaced the people, but we retained their god because we were scared the gods would otherwise turn against us. It's cruel, it's violent, but it's also telling you that in that one temple you have a tribal deity, you have a Brahminical deity, you have blood rituals being done for some of the gods, you have Pal Abhishekam and honey being poured and flowers being poured over another god. So that one temple's Hinduism is already a composite of something that came from a different direction and a Brahminical stream that came from somewhere else. So even when we use labels like this, we in a sense play down the complexity of what these categories actually hold. They are just words like Hinduism, Islam, Christianity. These are just words that make it easier for us to imagine the world in a certain way, to navigate the world. In a conversation, I can use this. But once you start looking at the details, it's very different. Christianity is full of schisms. There's the Persian churches, there's the Eastern Orthodox churches. When the Portuguese first came to India and they met the Nasranis in Kochi, they said, your churches all belong to the Pope. And the Nasrani said, who's the Pope? We've never heard of the Pope. Because they were not Catholics. They had their patriarchs coming in from Persia and the Persian church. And later they were linked to the Nestorians and so on. The Portuguese burnt their books. Technically, both are Christians, but the Portuguese went around burning the books of the Malayali Christians, outlawing their literature, outlawing the liturgy, apparently desecrating the tombs of some of their saints, because they said this is not Christianity, this is infidelity. Now, today a lot of people think the word infidel was used only against pagans or Hindus, but no, it was within Christians also. There were competing groups who did it. The same exists with Islam also. There are different groups in different places who practice it in different ways. As late as the 1940s, the Muslim League, Jinnah's party, they commissioned a report about Kashmiri Islam. And the report was scathing. It said, this isn't really Islam. We have no idea what this is. We'll have to go and train them about what real Islam is. But that's not actually what it was. It was just that the way Islam took form in Kashmir was a different thing. So the labels we use are all a bit too convenient as opposed to being completely suited to the complicated past that actually, they seek to represent. So people don't like it when you mention some of these things. They don't necessarily feel comfortable with that level of variety. But There was no homogenized culture in the past. There may have been impulses. Some would have felt, yes, there should be one unitary form of being Muslim or being Hindu. But those voices were one of several voices that existed and several voices that were claiming seats at the table and negotiating with each other. The past is always a story of negotiations. It was never really of one triumphing over the other.
Do you think there's an emergence of a very performative aspect to various pop cultures surrounding the topic of religion, cultural, and all these communal aspects? Do you think there's a performative aspect to it? Let's take for example even Ganesh Chaturthi, or recently there was this controversy in Kerala about a Muslim man and some controversy regarding a Muslim and Hindu, where the lens was not really necessary, but it was put on. So do you think there is a performative aspect to it?
Religion has always been performative, as it happens. It's not something that, in our time with television, social media, our analytical tools, we're able to see it a lot more and talk about it a lot more. Look at kings in the past. They were always performing, because when you have power, you're always trying to hold on to it. You use religion as one means to support it, and you perform in different ways. In Karnataka, Tipu Sultan is an annual controversy, whether his Jayanti should be celebrated, not be celebrated. What people don't realize is that both versions of Tipu Sultan existed simultaneously. In Karnataka, in Mysore, which he ruled and governed, he was sending Shivalingams to Sringeri and saying, do these pujas for my lingams. He was sending Shivalingams to one of the greatest Hindu spiritual figures that existed. He was protecting temples. He was sponsoring festivals in temples. His grants and donations and those inscriptions still exist. But the same man, when he comes into Kerala, he speaks a jihadist language because he's conquering this country. He needs something to support that act of conquest. So he says this is a country of infidels. And therefore, I'm here to, as a great Islamic monarch, to sort of spread Islam into this region. Because there he needed to perform the role of an Islamic king, as opposed to Mysore in his settled territories, where he was performing a much more familiar role he was of course a sultan, but he was also playing to the local Hindu elites and their ideas of what constituted a king. So the same man can perform it in different ways. It's not very different from our politicians today. Chhatrapati Shivaji, his father and uncle are named after a Muslim. His grandfather and father worked for Islamic sultanates. His father was one of the last people to try and keep the Nizam Shahi Sultanate going, maintained it till the Mughals ultimately defeated him. And yet when Shivaji himself consecrates himself as a king, as opposed to being a rebel or a warlord or just somebody who's carving out territory, when you need legitimacy, you need to crown yourself. At this time, he falls back on Sanskritic culture and commissions the Shiva Bharata, the Sanskrit poem, where he's Vishnu reborn to destroy the Muslims and regain power and so on. That is a very Hinduized version of Shivaji, because at that particular moment, he is communicating his Hindu credentials as a Hindu king in a world of Islamic sultans who are all his enemies. But does that mean he was actually anti-Muslim at the same time? No, because with his people, he's also got other incentives that are happening. So no one thing is true exclusively. Again, you find things happening simultaneously. So the performative aspect is not at all a new tendency. It's just that politicians now have perhaps grown even more sophisticated in how they perform. They have more tools at their disposal in order to do that performance. Everybody, you have parties like the Aam Aadmi Party that came up on one plank, but now you hear even their politicians making somewhat disappointing statements around religion and temple building and things like that, because you see they're an expanding party. They won more than one state now. They're expanding into new territories and new places. You have to appeal to people in new ways, and therefore you perform your politics in new ways. You have parties that are against beef in the Gangetic Hard Belt, but in the Northeast they'll be like, okay, the BJP will say, no, we have no issues with beef. So different places, the Congress party, how it operates in Kerala won't be how it operates in North India. So the same performative thing is a constant because it is linked more to power than to anything else. If you're in power, you're in the trade of performing for multiple people and retaining power and keeping those pieces in place for you to hold on to that power. So performativeness is just general. And besides, we live in the age of social media, so we're all performing also, no, all the time. It's seeped down from politics into our own everyday lives. To give you an example, I was at this festival in Karaikudi, and we went to this beautiful, stunning temple on this rock, and there was a cliff, and it was absolutely beautiful. And I was posting pictures, and so many messages saying, "Oh my God, so wonderful! You know, where are you? This is so great, la la la." And I felt obviously very validated that look at me under these blue skies, the rock and my white mundo in the wind and all of that. Very nice. But then in reality, what am I discussing with the person who's with me? I'm facing acidity for a while. And then she's like, I also have acidity. Let's talk about acidity. That is the reality of what we are actually discussing while we're climbing the rock. Whereas the world sees us perform something very different, right? So if it happens in our petty, mundane lives also, when you scale that up to the level of power and authority where the stakes are so much higher, you can only imagine that performativeness is a necessary ingredient of those spaces. No politician is ever going to cease performing. It's not just politicians, religious leaders, any kind of leader. You're always performing because it comes with the territory.
This is a bit specific. So in academic circles, we come across this Kerala exceptionalism. How do you view this trend, and where in religious plurality do you place this concept?
I don't think Kerala was exceptional. Kerala was exceptional to some extent because it was geographically often cut off from the rest of South India. So you find the Mughals or even the Islamic armies earlier, Delhi Sultanate, etc. None of them actually reached Kerala. We have one stray instance of a Mukilan Pada, as it's called, of a man who briefly comes into South Kerala, just north of Kanyakumari, which is really Tamil Nadu actually, rather than Kerala, and briefly holds some power there for a few weeks or months. And nobody even knows the name of this guy. He's simply called Mukilan or Mughal. That's all we know. The geography of Kerala sort of cut it out from what was happening in South India. Vijayanagara expanded across South India, absorbed Tamil Nadu, but for some reason never annexed Kerala. Kerala had these little kings. In the age of emperors and empires, Kerala continued to have kings ruling over very small enclaves. Trade was their priority. Most of their income came from trade with Arabs and then eventually Europeans, not from land revenue. In parts of Kerala, there wasn't even land tax. Kerala is crisscrossed with some 44 rivers or something, which means that even holding territory, large territories under one authority was difficult because with the rains, the tropical climate, you have the hills, you've got the sea, and the narrow strip that you have, which is the plains and the fertile territory. It's not easy to hold even that much. So it's geographical exceptionalism I do understand. One of the reasons why matriliny continued in Kerala for a long time. Dress habits were very different in Kerala for a long time. In Tamil Nadu, white is the color for widows, I think. In Kerala, white is what brides wear at their wedding. So just a set of hills separate the two regions, but you can still see that culture holding its own. But I think exceptionalism beyond that can sometimes be overstated. That way you can say the South is exceptional. The South is a peninsula, literacy rates are higher, women are treated somewhat better here compared to the North, so South is exceptional. You'll always find arguments to construct an exceptionalism for different places if you look hard enough. But I think it's just that in Kerala, because it was cut off from a lot of these broader trends, certain things survived for longer. Because matriliny survived for longer, literacy among women wasn't that much of a problem. Divorce rates are not much of an issue. My great-great-grandmother was a divorcee in the 1870s and 80s. It used to happen, not a big deal. Certain customs, etc., didn't exist. Economic control of assets often rested with women, not necessarily with men, because of the matrilineal system. It wasn't like women and men were equal, but it was just somewhat less unfair than other systems. So in certain areas, yes, you can trace certain aspects that make Kerala perhaps exceptional. But in other areas, I think it can also be overstated easily.
So of late, there's been this attack on academics who worked in Indian history in general and in Hinduism in particular. So there is this worrisome trend fashioned as decolonial critique that tries to paint the works of Sheldon Pollock, Rumila Thapar, etc. as Hindu-phobic and misinterpreting Indian history. So how do you see this, and what do you think are its implications on religious pluralism?
The implications are that we're all going to turn into idiots, because if you think Romila Thapar, all her life, her 90 years of existence, has just been peddling conspiracy theories and she's this wicked woman, frankly, we're idiots. That's not how the world works. The thing is, you can critique Romila Thapar because certainly she worked in a different period. There were certain impulses then, there were certain theories that were dominant then. A lot has changed. Evidence, the nature of evidence has changed, the nature of material has changed. Even then, though, if you read her works with an open mind, it's actually amazing how much has stood the test of time. You can critique her yet, of course, you can take a different perspective, but it's always a different perspective. The moment something turns into a personal attack, that this person is the face of a certain Western conspiracy, that kind of thing is more political than scholarly. That kind of thing is catering to either a sense of victimization, a constructive victimization. It's catering to some political energy that exists and needs that kind of constant feeding. Anytime you find a political setup creating villains constantly, manufacturing them day after day, fresh villains in different parts of the country, fresh figures as villains, it's actually an insecurity of that political phenomenon that is highlighted, because it is dependent on constructing enemies constantly. Forget Romila Thapar, A.K. Ramanujan, whose many essay on the many Ramayanas was banned and burnt and things like that. Wonderful scholar. One can disagree with certain things. One can even point out certain flaws in his work. Manu Devadevan, who otherwise admires him, has done that in one of his books, where he says that there were certain limitations in even Ramanujan's approach to the Veerashaivas, the Lingayats, and so on. So it's possible to critique, but it's not as if these people are standing up and saying that man, he had a bad agenda and that's why he wrote wrong history. History is an evolving field. As we learn more, we have clearer insights into the past. As now genetics studies, science, technology, including AI, the capacity to simply scan documents and archives has made our life easier. As all of that comes on board, as language skills get better, sometimes you find historians operating with one set of languages and one set of documents. Their conclusions are valid, but they can also be complicated by material from a different language, because they simply didn't have access to that language at that time. In Kerala history, one of the things I discovered is, as I was reading a lot of history in the second half of the 20th century, is that the archives concerned with the colonial period, they were all focused on what was available in Madras. But a lot of the most sensitive material was carried off to London, which meant that an entire 2 or 3 generations of historians simply did not have access to that material because it was not available, it was in a different continent. They were not sitting around a table plotting about how they're going to misinterpret Kerala history. It's just natural. These things happen. Historians are also human beings. We also make errors. We also have subconscious biases and limitations. But the way this trend goes currently, where this is all turned into a us versus them, this is an enemy and we are all the defenders of whatever they're trying to defend, is all of this is I think just politics. I don't think there's anything more to it, and I think we should not give it more credibility than it deserves. It's just gas in a space where we're constantly being fed distractions. One must always ask these people, come to the point. What exactly is your issue with Romila Thapar? Give me a list. And then let's engage on what exactly those issues are as issues. But the moment you start calling her names, the moment you start tweeting that, she's, well, I'm not even going to use some of the words that are used, that's not then an academic discussion at all. That's a completely different ball game.
Okay, we've had a long conversation about religious plurality, its history and historicity. What do you think are the lessons that we can carry forward for the future?
I don't know about lessons, because each of us would draw different lessons from the past. And also there's something very preachy about drawing lessons from the past, right? For historians to sit in grandstand and say that here are the lessons of history is a bit, it arrogates too much power to ourselves, as if we have already cracked the past completely and we know what is good and what is bad, what is black and what is white. That's not true. We are only connecting the dots, and what we're trying to say is that the world is more complex than we think. We in the present may want the world and want the past. We may wish it to look a certain way. Sadly, the past doesn't do that. Often, the more you study about the past, you don't get as many answers as questions. You end up with more questions than answers, which is why we keep doing more history, which is why we can never stop till we die, because we are constantly finding new things of interest, new things stimulating us. And frankly, a good historian is one who perhaps their first book might end up being very different from their 7th book. The 7th book may even disagree with their own earlier research, because they themselves have evolved, their mind has also evolved, and they themselves are growing in that time. So there are no lessons that history teaches us. Srinath Raghavan, I think, put it in an essay where he said, history doesn't teach any lessons, historians do. Which means also that a good historian must hold back and not give lectures on what history teaches, but simply encourage people to engage with the past with an open mind. Leave yourself open to the surprises. Leave yourself open to breaking down dogma. Leave yourself to be challenged by the past, where you're convinced the past is something, but hold on, it's not. It can be something as simple as, I went to America in June and I did a DNA test there. And it was fascinating because, of course, I got a basic outline that was somewhat predictable. I'm 42% Malayali. The remainder, some 30-something percent is Malayali mixed with Goan, Sri Lankan, Kannadiga, Telugu, Tamil. Basically, all of South India is involved in me. And then a small fragment is Persian and Central Asian. There's something or the other there. But what is interesting is that that test also connects you to other people in the database who've taken the test and with whom you share DNA, going back 6 generations. And there were 185 people. I had not met a single one of them, because we somehow share DNA, because we've all got so many great-great-grandparents, great-great-great-grandparents, that obviously there are linkages. It wasn't a fraud, because a lot of them came from the same geographical area in Kerala that I come from. But there were also challenges. There were a lot of Muslim names, Mallu Muslims. And I was like, where is this Muslim connection? I don't know about this. There were a lot of Malayali Christians. That I knew, because my grandmother had admitted to me once that a great-great-grandmother of mine had a Christian lover. So obviously the Christian lover left his DNA in us, and that's why I have a lot of Syrian Christian relatives in that part of Kerala. That surprised me. I was happy. Interesting. My great-great-grandmother had a personality. She had a life. That sort of thing upsets people. A lot of other people in the family, older people, would find that upsetting, because they've been raised on the idea that we were an orthodox family and we were very proper and this and that. But hold on, somebody was clearly naughty back in the day. So leaving ourselves open to that, leaving ourselves open to the idea that we might find surprises, unpleasant surprises, but also pleasant surprises, is what makes history interesting. Ultimately, it all boils down to keep your minds open. Do not use history as a means to fortify your identity, which is what we're increasingly being told to do. That history is a means to create this community and to hold it together, almost like this is some rigid thing that can't break or shouldn't break. Whereas think of it more as ripples on water, right? Something that's flowing, something that's constantly moving. That is what constantly changes and evolves and survives and bends when it needs to bend, blends in when it needs to, evaporates when it needs to. That is what keeps it dynamic and going. So if at all we learn anything from history, it is to keep our minds open and not succumb to that thing that all of history also warns us against, which is that human beings are incredibly stupid and we keep making the same mistakes again and again. And perhaps we're just engineered that way. But one can still hope and be optimistic that perhaps at our generation or our time, we won't make the same mistakes again. We'll cease to be as stupid as some of our ancestors, even if, of course, we must continue to have exciting lives like some of them.
I think this is one question that all of us are equally excited to know about. So what are your topics on books about religion and plurality and the concepts? And who is your favorite author of all times, regardless of which genre, or who are your favorite authors?
I sadly don't have a favorite author. I never had one. It's always different kinds of books in different formats. For literature or fiction, it'll be one set of authors. For non-fiction, it'll be something else. Sometimes you just get great joy from reading completely trashy books, just because at that moment you're so bogged down with work and you need a trashy book. You need something that's just, terribly dumb and stupid, because that's what gives you a break at that time. On flights, when I'm feeling like I need to pose as a more serious person, I read Agatha Christie's on flights. But sometimes I also read Jeffrey Archer and feel very happy about it, because I need that masala type Bollywoodized plot between things, between airports. With history books, I got great joy from Abraham Erali's series on Indian history, beginning with the Harappan period and so on, and ending with the Mughals. He's incredibly underrated. He passed away some years ago. But for anybody who needs an introduction to Indian history, those books are again very sweet, very readable, very charming books. So that kind of thing still brings back good memories. At the same time, my introduction to the very concept of critical thinking, learning to interrogate the past, ask questions of the past and the present, comes from a rather academic text by Meera Nanda called Prophets Facing Backward, which I read when I was 18 or 19 years old. Dense prose, tough language, jargon, all of that. But at the end of it, I plodded through. At the end of it, it really did enlighten me in certain respects. So in different areas, at different moments, you really want different things. So it's very tough to name any favorites. And I think that's how it should be. Like if one has in anything, right, in life, in politics, if one has a very fixed ideology that simply refuses to move, if one has a very fixed favorite or a very fixed thing in general, then you're already forcing yourself to one position without giving yourself the room to breathe and to explore and to learn and then reach certain conclusions. And by the time we reach any conclusions, we should ideally be very old and on our deathbeds. Till then, we should be open to new things. So I think under that philosophy, therefore, I don't really have any one favorite or any one fixed thing. It's a series and it might change from time to time.
I think with this, we come to the end of our questions. We open to the audience to ask questions.
No hands though.
Hi, I think I'm audible now. So you talked about how religions in the past were very syncretic in terms of how they interact with each other, but how do you state that, like, how do you say in the modern era there has been a lot more homogenization and a lot of a homogenization of religion in terms of how people mobilize a lot of people. So how do you feel in the modern era is going to play out in terms of in a world where social media and like cultural globalization exists?
Yeah, one of the reasons we are seeing what we're seeing, which is people relating to these broad labels and feeling like they're all one thing, is not necessarily because other people are telling them that. It's because technology of our time enables it. On social media, for example, there are horrible opinions expressed, sexist opinions, anti-minority opinions, whatever it is. But the thing is, there were people with those opinions 20 years ago also. It's just that they didn't have a platform where they could all air it together and create a community that felt it and therefore was able to assert itself. Whereas now they do. Through social media, if you're sitting in Bangalore, someone else is sitting in Chennai, and you have the same opinion and you air it in public, you've already formed a connection there and you feel, hold on, I'm not alone. I can boldly express this and there are other people who will come to my support and be part of this. So that enables a certain kind of tendency. And in general also, look at the earlier powers or groups that came into India. It's not just the Mughals who came from outside, the Ahoms who came in from Southeast Asia, etc. All of these groups came in, but these were times when they couldn't easily go back. Technology wasn't there to communicate also with homelands. Even the East India Company, when it first came into India, it took 6 to 10 months to get a letter, that you'd send to get a reply to the letter, which meant that people on the ground had to just take decisions, they had to reach compromises. So for the longest time, the British used to make donations to temples. They used to protect the Jagannath temple in Puri. They used to give ornaments and great gifts, etc., to Tirupati and all kinds of places. Because they felt the need to sort of blend in with local culture to protect their own power. What happens with technology, the steamship, etc., coming in, is that this gap between home and here is shrunk. Suddenly, you don't need to do that. Earlier, they could marry local women and have children with these local women. Now, increasingly, women from home were able to come off to India because it was easier now to come. So, in a sense, the British became more aloof because technology enabled them to be aloof. If it was earlier times, they would perhaps have tried to blend a little bit more with local people. So in the first half of the 19th century, they're still giving rewards to Brahmins and organizing Sanskrit festivals and debates and things like that. By the second half of the 19th century, you've got Macaulay's vision coming into play because it's enabled by technology and a greater sense of control. That's what's happening in our time also. Now these barriers have gone. With Kerala's, not just Hinduism, where Hindus are changing the way they behave, even Kerala's Islam, right? Very different kind of Islam. The costume, the way people thought of themselves. With greater exposure to the Gulf, people feel that the real elite Islam is what comes from the Gulf. So you find a sort of Gulfization or an Arabization of Islam in Kerala happening, just as you find a homogenization of Hinduism happening in the same region, where Hindus now, I got into some trouble for saying this, but we dropped all our vernacular names. We used to have some very nice, interesting vernacular names in Kerala. Chiruta, Ikkava, Teyunni, Appunni, Ramunni. All of those names have vanished, and now we have these generic Rahul, Rohit, Aditya, names that could be anywhere in India, right? The problem is that what made it Malayali was some of these vernacular names. But those vernacular names no longer have that kind of value. They're almost extinct. So technology enables some of that, and that's why I think we succumb to this. I don't know what will happen in future. None of us can predict. But hopefully if we tell ourselves some of these stories of the past and remind ourselves that the past does have a richer something to offer, then people will invest after a while. See, people also get bored of things. So if right now Rahuls and Adityas are fashionable, after a while perhaps Rahul's grandchildren will be named Ikkav and Chiruta and Teyunni or whatever. Because people will feel the need to go back to authentic roots of a different type. Homogenization is happening now, but into the future we have no way of predicting how it will turn out eventually. So yeah, that's again a complicated answer to your simple question.
With this, we come to the end of our fireside chat today.
Alas.
We would now like to request our faculty advisor, Dr. Basavaraj, to felicitate our dignitary with the memento. We would like our guest to leave his words of wisdom for the IITM community in the AML yearbook. We thank each and every one of you present here to the event. I hope all of you had a great time. We thank everyone who made this event a success. We would like to go forward with many such endeavors forward. Thank you all.